Hello, everyone. Welcome to an episode of We Witnessed. My name is Chip Brewster. I'm a national digital host with Nexstar Media. If this is your first We Witness episode, you're in for a treat. What we do, because Nexstar Media has more than 100 newsrooms across the country, is we dig through the archives of those newsrooms and look for those stories that began as a local story, maybe kind of innocuous, and grew into something of more prominence, perhaps a national headline or a talker or something of keen interest. And that is very true of today's episode. We're going to feature our station KRON, better known as KRON 4 in San Francisco, and a particular case where the details of the crime itself aren't particularly impactful, but the investigation and the stance that police took on that investigation certainly make this a talker. To set the scene, we flash back to 2015, within the 24 hours after Denise Huskins went missing, reportedly abducted.
Miss Huskins stands at 5'7", 150 pounds. She's got blonde hair and blue eyes.
And Denise Huskins was last seen here on Mare Island, where the Solano County Office of Emergency Services has teamed up with Vallejo police in an all-out search effort to find her.
The Solano County search and rescue team has dedicated upwards of 75 people so far.
On Tuesday, I spotted searchers combing a field not far from the location where she was allegedly kidnapped.
All right.
Yeah.
You have to go that side of that point.
Search dogs were also weaving through tall grass looking for any clues of her disappearance. The canines are also being used to check abandoned buildings here on the former U.S. Naval Base. Back at the search and rescue staging area, more resources are coming in from all across the Bay Area, including specially trained deputies from Contra Costa and Alameda counties. Vallejo police investigators say they have received some leads in the case, but won't discuss any possible connection to the locations being searched on Mare Island.
We have received some phone calls, but I'm not at liberty to discuss what the tips were.
On Mare Island, in Vallejo, Hazik Medyoun, KRON 4 News.
I'm going to bring in now a reporter who covered the story extensively, Mr. Dan Kerman. And you're still a KRON 4 reporter. You began at the station in 2002, so you've got 20 plus years of experience in the San Francisco area. For this story, you know, it began, and I hesitate to say anything is a typical crime, but it began as just a missing persons case, possibly abducted. And so the way it's being covered here and even the story is all kind of standard fare at this point. Do you recall your first introduction to Denise Huskins and her disappearance?
Well, it was pretty standard fare until, but only standard fare for a couple of days.
Yeah.
And that's when police did what they did, which is when she had been dropped off after the kidnapping. And I don't want to get ahead of the story, but a couple of days later, she was dropped off at her parents' home in Southern California. And then police came out and said the whole thing was a hoax, which turned out not to be true. And what's interesting about this is, as you know, from covering any kind of case like this, typically police say very little at the beginning. They say very little about the sources they're looking into. They say very little about what things they're, what might be going on here or there. And in this case, you have the Vallejo Police Department not only dispensing details, but you have them dispensing the wrong details just within 2 days of her kidnapping and then of her release and saying, hey, nothing to see here. This is all a hoax. And then, of course, as it turned out, that was completely wrong. So it was pretty routine to start with, but quickly became not routine.
And you jumped right to it. The main reason that this one became such interest, in fact, as we talk, there was a 2024 Netflix docuseries specifically on this case. Denise Huskins ended up writing a book about it because it was of such interest. So I'm going to take a moment now. We're going to pause and go back to 2015 one more time to really lay it out, everything that you just told us, and show our viewers some of that archival footage that lays out that full story.
Miss Huskins stands at 5'7", 150
Here in
pounds.
Vallejo, police are investigating a possible abduction for ransom.
A home on the former Mare Island Naval Base. Sometime early Monday, Aaron Quinn says Denise Huskins is forcibly taken at gunpoint. Even though he waits 12 hours to report it, investigators take the story seriously.
We are treating this as a kidnap for ransom.
A day-long search on land and in the bay fails to find any clues to her whereabouts. But the next day, Huskins turns up at her father's home in Orange County. She calls her father, who had flown to Vallejo.
She said, "Daddy, I'm safe. they let me go.
Huskins is spotted briefly in Southern California, then flies back to the Bay Area, where Vallejo police are not calling it a kidnap, but a hoax.
Mr. Quinn and Ms. Huskins has plundered valuable resources away from our community.
I can say that they are absolutely wrong.
Blatant lies.
On Thursday, lawyers for both Quinn and Huskins declare their clients are now being victimized by police. But even they admit that the emails, the strangely low ransom demand, and Huskins' reappearance at her family home raise a lot of questions.
It's all insane. None of this makes any sense.
And they started to touch on it there, Dan, but I wanted to dive into those details a little bit more about why it was. What is it that police said and cited that made them believe it was a hoax to the point where they felt comfortable saying so publicly?
Well, from the get-go, you know, they were looking at Aaron Quinn, her boyfriend, as a possible suspect in all of this. Then that sort of fell through. Then her showing up a couple of days later in Southern California, and whatever it was, there did not seem to be a whole lot of due diligence on the part of the Vallejo Police Department. And as you know, there was a big settlement with Denise Huskins and her boyfriend in the millions over them calling this a hoax.
Yeah.
But you know, and as it turned out, you know, several months went on before they were able to link these two things together. Vallejo police sort of threw up their hands in the air and said, we've decided it's a hoax and we're moving on from here. What made them come to that decision? I don't know if it was lousy police work or overburdened with other kinds of things, but there really wasn't enough here. As I said, when you look at other police organizations and how little they give you from the get-go in terms of what they're looking at, why they're looking at it, because they're trying to get all their ducks in a row before they come out with it. And in this case, you know, in terms of good news for the media, Vallejo police are talking. Bad news for Vallejo police, they've jumped to the wrong conclusion.
And it's hard to, because from a media standpoint, now it has been a while since I've been a beat street reporter like yourself, but correct me if my own experience is wrong. When I am out there, I try to ask questions of everybody that I can, certainly witnesses, victims, if I can get a hold of them, but it's the police whose literal job it is to investigate, to gather evidence, to reach a factual conclusion. And so I tend to lean into what they say because that's their job. Was there any of that in this case for you or your fellow reporters when you heard authorities claim that this was a hoax?
I can't quite remember that far back if we were like, oh, it is a hoax or not. I think that there was some sort of, there was not a total buy-in to that, certainly, because they were so, because Denise Huskins and her boyfriend and their attorneys were so vehement about, no, this really happened. And then as it turned out, the suspect and the person who's gone to jail for multiple attacks was a serial kidnapper and a serial raper, and in a sense was very good at doing what he was doing, meaning he was able to do these things and not come under police radar for any of them. Until this case, and actually it wasn't even this case that he came under police radar, it was the next one.
Right, and we are going to get to that. I do want to talk about at least one of the oddities that came up that had people broadly unsure. I'll just say that. They questioned, is this a hoax, is this not? And that was specifically emails. So I've got another clip, 2015 from KRON, and then we'll play that and come right back and talk about it here in a moment.
Tuesday's San Francisco Chronicle reports the alleged kidnappers sent an email to the paper demanding Vallejo police and specifically Lieutenant Kenny Park apologize for calling the kidnapping, quote, an orchestrated event. The paper says the email also has a veiled threat if they don't apologize, specifically saying, we may be the direct agent of harm, but it will be made crystal clear that the Vallejo Police Department and you, Mr. Park, had every opportunity to stop it. Vallejo police did not apologize and did not respond to our request for comment. The email the Chronicle received is one of several since the alleged kidnapping of Denise Huskins. The paper quotes the alleged kidnappers as saying they were, quote, a sophisticated group of criminals who were sorry for their actions, that they ran, quote, an elaborate car theft operation on Mare Island for months and had burglarized several homes, taking car keys and personal information stored on home computers, that they had turned to kidnapping for ransom because they, quote, did not want to stay thieves or criminals forever. What we really wanted to do was complete one or two big jobs and then to do whatever we felt like for the rest of our lives.
And Dan, that's one of those things. Like, I read this, I saw this story, and I went, that is so strange. Like, would an actual kidnapper send emails in saying, no, you're wrong, I exist, come find me, come catch me? Or the inverse of that, would it have been Quinn saying, oh, I can send these emails to try and make it appear like it wasn't me, which is where a lot of the public opinion were caught between. Do you recall when these emails were sent in?
Right. And it was just another level of bizarre.
Yeah.
I mean, just simply when you're talking about police calling it a hoax and making this determination in 2 days and the vehement denial by the victims of this thing. And then on top of that, you get these emails saying, oh, exactly, here's what it is, A, B, C, D, E. I think that we felt like that those emails were really not telling the story, that might have been the actual kidnapper trying to divert suspicion. And in this case, that's exactly what they were trying to do.
Yep, and we are going to talk about the actual kidnapper because, yes, there is a real person behind this event and others after a short break. So if you're interested in the final details of the story, don't go anywhere. Welcome back to We Witness. Chip Brewster here, Dan Kerman joining me from KRON 4 in San Francisco. We're talking about the Denise Huskins kidnapping case. And up to this point, Dan, we've kind of covered the details, the search that was underway when no one had any idea that it was a abduction versus hoax. And then now we're at the point of, oh no, we will learn that this was indeed a real abduction. And why? Because they found the man that did it. So if you would take us back to that time in 2015, you were giving me the notes beforehand, so I'll let you set up South Lake Tahoe.
Well, the first thing to remember is this kidnapping was in March of 2015. Yes. And the capture of this guy was not until June of 2015, and it had nothing to do with this case, and Vallejo police were not involved in it whatsoever. It turned out that the suspect, and who was eventually convicted of this and countless other crimes, burglarized a family's home in Dublin, which is also in the East Bay, not in Vallejo, but in the East Bay, and he left a cell phone behind. And that really set things off in motion, which led police to the South Lake Tahoe cabin where Matthew Muller was. And once there, they found all kinds of things which eventually linked him to the Denise Huskins case. And again, it was Alameda County Sheriff's Office and Dublin Police that put this all together and then worked with the FBI and then realized, look what we've got here. This was the real thing. And
I have some of my own notes on what they found in South Lake Tahoe. So they found a laptop that fit the description of one that Quinn said had been taken. They found a pair of goggles similar to what Huskins had described as being forced to wear on the night of the abduction. They also found a long blonde hair similar to Huskins' hair on a pair of goggles. And then I think the most damning evidence was in the car's navigation system. In South Lake Tahoe, they found evidence of a drive to Huntington Beach, which is the location in Southern California where her father lived, where she was ultimately dropped off the 2 days after being abducted. So all of those things come together. As you stated, they weren't even there for this particular case, but they start to connect the dots. What happened between them finding him and him being ultimately convicted after a guilty plea?
Well, and then he was finally charged in June of that month, again, a couple of months later. And then, again, like I said, they really put this whole thing together. And he was eventually convicted in this case. And as I also mentioned, too, the Vallejo Police Department finally came forward and paid a big settlement to Denise Huskins and Aaron Quinn over calling this a hoax. And, the details you mentioned, too, in terms of the blonde hair and the GPS drive to Huntington Beach. I mean, it wasn't a couple of random things that they found. It was like they were just laying out a specific roadmap, and only because he had broken into this home in Dublin. And these detectives followed up on it, and they followed up on all the evidence. And that's how we got to this point of his arrest and ultimately his conviction.
Did you cover much of the trial itself?
I covered some of the trial and some of the, but definitely the sentencing.
Mm-hmm.
As again, what is interesting is at this point, at the time of the sentencing, we are of the belief that here's this former attorney who had done this, and maybe was this a one-off, or we know he had broken into another home in Dublin and so forth and so on. But at the time of this sentencing, we had absolutely no idea that he was a serial kidnapper and a serial rapist. And after this whole conviction for the Denise Huskins case, he would be found to be guilty of several others.
Well, let's bring you back to your own reporting from 2015, that sentencing story that you put together, and then we will continue the conversation talking about those additional crimes he was ultimately found guilty of.
A federal judge has sentenced Matthew Muller to 40 years in prison for the March 2015 kidnapping of Denise Huskins from her boyfriend Aaron Quinn's Vallejo home. The sentencing came after impassioned pleas from both Quinn and Huskins describing their ordeal.
Aaron and Denise are the most courageous young people I've ever met in my life. I mean, I'm so proud of them. And I had no idea how awful it was for Denise.
Cameras were not allowed in the courthouse, but both Huskins and Quinn argued Muller should be sentenced to life in prison. Huskins saying she still has nightmares and keeps a hammer by the bed. Quinn saying after his ordeal, he will never be the same. But the judge went with the recommendation of federal prosecutors.
Closure is a fantasy. It makes it less. Not having to come down and see Matt Muller again for the rest of my life is a good thing.
While the federal case is over, the civil case continues. Huskins and Quinn suing the city of Vallejo, who at one point accused Huskins of making it all up and saying that she owed the city of Vallejo an apology. At the federal courthouse in Sacramento, Dan Kerman, KRON 4 News.
And you mentioned it there, Dan. You talked about the details a little bit before we played the story, but there was ultimately a settlement. I have my notes here that they sued for false imprisonment, defamation, false arrest, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and it was a $2.5 million settlement in 2018. But there wasn't an official public apology from the city until 2021, which only came after Huskins and Quinn released a book documenting their ordeal. So this was something that went on for years, despite the entirety of the events taking place within 2 to 3 days.
Yeah, absolutely. And $2.5 million, I'm sure if you ask them, doesn't cover what they had to go through and being accused of making it all up. And then on top of that, they come to find that, as you mentioned, that this guy is a serial rapist. And that all sort of came to light. And Denise Huskins was involved in that. She had gone on to work with the Seaside Police Department down in Monterey County. And there she helped them in terms of how do you deal with suspected sexual assault victims, and how do you get information from them, and the best way to deal with these things. All the things that were not done in her case, she's now working with this police department. And it's through those conversations that the Seaside Police something pinged them, and then there was a sort of a domino effect, and then come January of 2025, he is back in. Matthew Muller is taken out of prison, and he's back in court for 2 more sexual assaults in Santa Clara County in the San Jose, Palo Alto, Mountain View area, which actually happened before the Denise Huskins case.
Yeah, and that wasn't the only thing that came to light in January 2025 as well. We have one more story to run, so this one's not quite as archival as the other videos because it's from 2025, but it sums up nicely those additional details.
Matthew Muller, the disbarred Harvard-trained lawyer and convicted kidnapper, was sentenced on Thursday to 7 years to life in prison in a Contra Costa County courtroom. The latest punishment stems from a 2015 home invasion in San Ramon involving 3 victims, one of multiple attacks Muller has admitted to.
He ultimately forced one of the 3 to leave the house and go obtain money, a little over, somewhere over $30,000, on the threat of hurting or killing the family if they didn't do that.
The attack happened in the spring of 2015, around the same time as the infamous Vallejo case that was later featured in the Netflix docuseries American Nightmare. Muller is currently serving 40 years in federal prison for kidnapping and sexually assaulting Denise Huskins. Vallejo police initially dismissed her story as a hoax, only to reverse course after Muller's arrest. Huskins has since worked with Seaside Police to help improve how sexual assault cases are handled. In the San Ramon case, Muller pleaded no contest to 1 count of kidnapping for ransom.
We've been in touch with the victims, and they're obviously very relieved to know that he's been sentenced to so much time here in California on top of his federal cases. So they are relieved to know that, he'll very likely never see the outside.
Muller has also been sentenced for a series of home invasions in Santa Clara County, crimes he allegedly confessed to in letters sent from prison. He has also pleaded guilty to kidnapping and sexually assaulting a girl from Folsom Lake when he was just 16 years old. We're told the victims in the San Ramon case never reported the crime. Fearing retribution, they've chosen to remain anonymous.
So they are still to this day very afraid about what happened. So nothing will ever take away those last 10 years or what happened that night, but they are very grateful to know that he was prosecuted here in California and that Muller will be held accountable for all the things he's done.
Reporting in Contra Costa County, Gail Ong, KRON 4 News.
So there we are hearing those details, multiple cases that came to light, one that wasn't even reported that he was ultimately found guilty of through some confession. And I want to take a minute. I don't do this on every episode of We Witness, Dan, but I want to give a little bit of background on Matthew Muller himself. I do like to stay kind of crime and victim centric, but there's some interesting details to his life. He was an honorably discharged Marine after developing mental health issues while deployed, though never in combat. He was a Harvard-educated immigration lawyer who actually gained some prominence in the field. He was disbarred in 2015 after a decline in mental health, diagnosed with bipolar disorder with psychotic features and schizophrenia. And then allegedly he had developed a delusion that he should kidnap, quote, evil, wealthy people for ransom to give to the poor. So it's just painting a bigger picture of this man that committed all of these crimes over all of these years, and notably including one when he was 16 years old. So this is not, the latter half of his life type developments, but just kind of fascinating to bring all those details together and ultimately have all of these cases solved almost at the same time because of that break in the Denise Huskins case.
Absolutely. And at least 6 convictions, 5 different counties in California. I mean, when you think about it, just frightening how many of these had gone unsolved or unreported. And then through due diligence and even in the case in Santa Clara County with the Palo Alto and the Mountain View ones that took place beforehand, what they did in those cases was they retested DNA because DNA testing finally had improved. They had tested these things before, nothing had come up, DNA testing improved, and they took the time to retest. And that was how this connection was made. So that all, really means that, law enforcement taking the time, going back, can get some real results.
And this is not the first We Witnessed episode either, where the story we've taken a look at had permanent structural changes to the way that police investigated certain crimes, certainly spoke publicly about certain crimes. You had mentioned, and I just want this to be our last note, that Denise Huskins went on to work with at least one specific Seaside Police Department and how they respond to these types of cases. Do you feel that this whether it's Denise's case or anything related to Matthew Muller, has had a bigger impact even beyond Seaside Police?
Oh, I think so. I mean, I think especially in the Bay Area, just because of how this whole thing unfolded and what eventually became of it, I'm sure that police organizations, many were probably crossing their T's and dotting their I's beforehand. But now I think you can't not pay a lot more attention to how things are done, or even taking a look at going back and retesting DNA as advances are made to track people down.
Yeah. Well, Dan, I appreciate you taking the time to revisit this case from more than a decade ago and the uniqueness of police taking a hoax stance on something that ultimately was proven true.
Pleasure to be here.
Yep. Until the next We Witnessed episode, I'm Chip Brewster. Take care, everybody.